Hello and welcome to Reed Scholars Live. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Fleming, current president of Reed Scholars. I have the opportunity today to be joined by a previous president of Reed Scholars, Dr. Mallory Williams. Dr. Mallory Williams is a trauma surgeon and currently serves as the chief of the Division of Trauma and Critical Care and the director of surgical intensive in the surgical intensive care unit in the Department of Surgery at Howard University. In addition to this, he's a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve's Medical Corps. For those of you all who didn't have time to listen to our past podcast, I take this opportunity to look at Mallory's podcast dated March the 9th. You'll get a little bit more information about his background and his journey and a little bit more about his perspective on gun violence. But we wanted to talk about current events today. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to join you, Mary.
And tell us a little bit about where you are and what you're doing in this moment.
I have the pleasure to be currently deployed overseas in Honduras, where we are very much involved in fighting and avoiding the pandemic that is in the United States. Here at Joint Task Force Bravo base, where we serve pretty much as a presence in this region for humanitarian assistance, as well as sort of a check against narco-terrorism activities. And so I'm deployed here. I've been promoted. I'm a colonel now, and it's good to be here in many ways.
Fair enough. Well, that's exciting. A different frame of reference from the pandemic that most of us are having here in America. And as you can imagine, things have erupted in a different way in the midst of the pandemic right now, and our streets are filled with protesters who are, trying to figure out how to wrap our mind around the recent police brutality and the amount of violence in our streets. And I, thought we could take a little bit of time to contextualize that, because we know this is not a new fight, right? This is a resurgence of a ongoing fight. I won't even say it's an old fight. So just from your perspective, give us a little background and tell us, how do you think we got here?
Well, I think, thank you for the question. I think that it's important to understand just how long of a struggle this challenge has been. And you can look in some of Gordon Parks' famous photos going all the way back to 1963, and you see Gordon capturing imagery of well-dressed African-American men in suits peacefully protesting with signs saying police brutality must end. Right. 1963, that was still an issue in our country, and people were still protesting it. So the question becomes, what, in a sense, with time has changed, and what particular in this moment has captured this latest incident in the minds of Americans in such a way where we've seen the responses that we have witnessed. And I think there time where most Americans were following pandemic precautions. They were socially distancing themselves, they were at home, and so there was the time to take a rather in-depth look at this instance. There wasn't the job, there wasn't the many other things that we might be doing in societies to really interfere with our attention. So we all were, in a sense, looking for something to fill that space that would have been filled with something else in a normal American life. And sports are not there, many other different activities are not there. And so we really had this time to look in detail and think and reflect on this. I think the second thing is that the differential response and the differential impact of COVID-19 in different communities also is another layer of frustration
Mm-hmm.
that can kind of collide and come together along with the experience that we um, saw when we really were able to have nothing else to think about but a video of a law enforcement officer and being in proximity with a person who was in custody in such a violent way that resulted in that person's the end of that person's life. And so I think the context, and thank you for asking me about it, is important because you've got another big thing occurring that has a differential impact in communities, and you have the space and the time to really, for all Americans, to digest what they saw in terms of this particular egregious act. And I think that is why you see the magnitude of the response. And I really want to uh, be very nuanced in my answering the question because I think it's important. There is outrage not just in one community. There is
Right.
outrage in a multiplicity of communities across America, and you are seeing people stand up and speak and vividly say things about this incident that you haven't heard previously.
Right.
So to just say that this is the same thing again and again and again is just simply not true. Even in my remote location and part of the world where I am right now, in following the threads on Facebook, in being exposed to the streaming news, you see a different response coming from different communities about how this impacted them personally. To be a central part of the country that they were living in, and the disgust that they, quite frankly, feel when they talk about it and look at it. And so I think that has to be said, that has to be acknowledged because it's important.
I think that's
And
true. I mean, you brought up several good points. I just want to highlight that I think because COVID-19 had already exposed this layer of inequity, again, that already existed, but now it's on front and center. And because people are at home, and because we are all, on high anxiety at baseline, and to have such an egregious act happen to stimulate further conversation and then action. Is different. The response is different. The energy is different. The feeling is different than
and for
than it
those of
was.
us who have followed these acts, you have to ask the question, okay, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, Samuel DuBose, Walter Scott, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Sean Reed, Stephen DeMarco Taylor, Ariana McCray, Terrence Franklin, Walter Lewis Franklin. So why am I able to name all of these names sequentially? And yet we didn't see the responses of this magnitude when pretty much similar acts occurred in those instances. And so it is the fact that we had time in our life to pay attention to this. And it is, in fact, as you said, inequity had been exposed in a vivid way by the pandemic before this act. If we can seize it, to go about evaluating and go forward from this in a different way because there is the attention that has been given to this.
And and not to detract, but it's something that is often, I think, placed as a distractor in the conversation around police brutality is the gun violence issue and the gun violence issue that's existing in the community. And so we had this conversation a little bit before, but I just wanted to ask you to contextualize that a little bit here so that people are not distracted when that conversation comes up in the context of what's going on now.
Yeah, I think it's important because oftentimes we have to be very careful.
So my next question to follow up about accountability. So on a few different levels. So one, one of the things the protesters are asking for is accountability, so that the police officers and other members who were involved in these
Sure.
uh, this level of violence or brutality are held accountable to their as far as their jobs and as far as prosecution. That's part of what they're asking for. And I think the other thing, when we think about accountability, when something happens, we want the punishment to match the crime, right? So there are times in which there's clearly somebody may have committed a crime or did something wrong, but they didn't necessarily need the level of punishment that they received, right? So
Sure.
even if you're guilty of a $20 forgery situation, doesn't mean that your punishment equals death. And so when we talk about accountability, we all need to be, like you said, accountable across the board. So I was just going to ask you to speak a little bit about how do we build in, we can build in the accountability for these individuals, but we want it to be an accountability process across the board, right? A systemic accountability. How do you think we get there? How do we build that in?
Well, I think we start off with a conversation where it is easy to have multiple stakeholders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about an America, a country that we all love and live in and have sacrificed for, we can imagine what we want other. I don't want to get too philosophical in nature, but certainly Rawls had it correct when he talked about a prepositioned point where we don't know who we are in society, and we begin to create the rules of society from a blind spot, so that we begin to consider ourselves in everyone else's shoes. And then we come up with a more fair society because we don't know who, in fact, we're going to be in that society. And I think it's just absolutely critical. A couple of things. The first is people in this society are innocent until proven guilty. That's a constitutional reality, right? And therefore, we want that be a reality for those people who are in custody. But here's the bitter pill. We want that be a reality for those people who may be seen, okay, of visually doing something, okay, that leads to a person death. That means as much as we want the shroud of innocence to be considered for ourselves, we have to be willing to place that on someone else. And so the officer who has been charged under our society, based upon the rules and the social contracts that we agree to enter into, will be considered innocent until he has his day in court and he is shown before his peers. There is overwhelming evidence of things. We have to be willing to say that, because that's a part of our society. That's a contract. We don't break contracts in society because we don't like something, right? So just as much as we think that officer broke the contract as it related to his person in custody, Mr. Floyd, and that's certainly what I think occurred based upon the visual evidence that's available, I've got to be willing to abide by my contract with society. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is a bigger question that we as a society have to ask ourselves. And it's also, quite frankly, a difficult question. And that is, do we want there to be state executions? Right? And so we have to understand that police are in a unique, empowered position in our society. They legislatively have the right and the power to take life. Right. And so when police, a law enforcement person who took someone's life, that is a state killing, because they are empowered by the legislature That is us as a society agreeing on principles by which we want to be governed and issuing special powers to different points of the society to do certain things. And one of their powers is the taking of life, which should be rare. And so, in a sense, it's too miniature, it's too small to talk about police killing unarmed Black men in custody. What we really are talking about at a more sophisticated level is state killings. And we don't like to think about it like that, but that in fact is what it represents. And they move under the rubric of the powers that we provide them in that society. And I don't think any American wants to think that we live in a country where disadvantaged or detained individuals could be subject to state uh, murder. And so I don't think that's the way we think about ourselves. I don't think that's the way we think about our country. And so if we begin the conversation with some basic principles that we all can agree upon, then we can derive an equation by which we can not only deal with what we saw, the horrific images that we saw in the video of horrific images that we saw when Tamir Rice was executed in the park, and there was no crime that was being committed, and there was no suggestion of a crime that was being committed. Police rolled up, got out the car, and then shot that child, and he died. To look at that as anything other than a state execution would be disingenuous. And so I think we can begin with those principles, and we can derive a place and a space where we then say, perhaps we want to look at this more carefully. Unfortunately, I have to tell you, we've had a 21st Century Commission on Policing that was convened by our former president. And the recommendations that came from that Commission on Policing really said little about data collection on deaths in custody. It was really the public advocacy from the scholars and the advocacy groups that later kind of forced Attorney General Loretta Lynch to a place where the death in custody reporting system was once again funded and active, so that we would have some kind of public accounting of the number of people that die in the hands of police. So imagine that. We had a commission on public policing, on modern policing. It was led by an African American police chief. And the recommendations that came from that under an African American president and an African American attorney general said nothing about counting the lives that were lost while in custody of United States police. When we think about these issues, we have to think deeply, we have to think broadly, and all of our sacred pets have to be put on the table. We can spare no one if the issue truly is about the life of an innocent or unarmed person in custody. Then everybody's got to be looked at and reviewed based upon that same principle, if we're going to have a genuine conversation.
I have many follow-up questions. First one. So when we think about changing, so one, you talked a lot about it, the baseline data. We need data around what's happening, who's dying, why, where, when, that type of thing. But when we think about data collection in this country, and we think about, using the framework of COVID-19, when we rolled out the COVID-19 response, this state was doing one thing, this state was doing this thing, this state was doing another thing. And because we're not centralized in that way, I think a lot of people are looking to the federal government for some type of guidance, which, that's not the type of guidance we're getting right now. So how do we get the states on board to do something similar so that we can make a coordinated effort to make things better across the board, as opposed to, state X doing great and state Z, saying this is not our problem?
Well, Madam President, you're hitting on all cylinders in this interview. You're really pushing me here because that is a spot-on policy question, right? There are the enumerative powers of the Constitution, which the federal government has, and then all of the powers are allocated to the states. So are we going to have a country where every state has a different manner of dealing with equity and fair treatment in law enforcement? Wow. Then overlay that with the historical fact that if you are a minority in this country, if you are a woman in this country, you have always relied on a strong federal government to be the place of last resort to protect your rights. Okay, your rights were not protected under states' rights historically. So we got to know history, right? If we're going to create good solutions. We can't say every state's going to do their own thing, and then you, as a minority in any class of that, think that that's going to protect you. Historically, we've always needed protection from the federal government, whether it was during times of integration or any other time. And so, further complicated is, what do you do when the politics of the particular situation may find you without a reasonable voice inside the administration? Right? Some may say your politics is too leftward leaning. Some may say your politics are appropriate because they are around your interests. And if someone or something is not appropriate to your interests, you shouldn't have relationships or conversations with that individual. I think as Reede Scholars, we learned that as people focused in policy, we have to be in conversation and communication, irrespective of who the entity is that may be governing the administration, to start a conversation and influence a given policy, even if it's not to the maximal effect that you would like. The question becomes even more pertinent because we see that the officer who is accused of ending Mr. Floyd's life was charged with third-degree murder.
Right.
Well, there are only 3 states in the United States that have third-degree murder charges: Florida, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. So if he had done the same thing in any of the 47 other states, would there have been the correct charges to even bring him to some account for what he had done? It gets very complicated. And then you can throw some prosecutorial discretion in there and even complicate the conversation more. But let me try with this. We know that third-degree murder says that the murder was unintentional, but it was depraved. Okay, the act itself was not a logical or defendable act based upon human behavior. Well, there are people, and some of them may be protesters, who may disagree with that charge, right? But then you got to understand the legal system. It's not about what you say someone did, it's about what you can prove with the evidence present. So I take that prosecutor at their word that they can bring charges for a third-degree murder, and based upon the evidence that they have thus far seen, that they can prove that charge. And that may not be what a lot of people like. More people may want more stringent charges, but what is provable may be third-degree murder. And if that's the case, then the question is, should we be looking at referendums or opportunities to have third-degree murder charges in more states so that people who are revered by the society have a position in the society, yet there is a shadow of doubt. There is a break in the evidence that might not lead us to first degree or second degree. There is still a window of charges to put those cases into so that we can begin to approximate justice. Well, in Florida and Pennsylvania, a third degree murder charge will buy you up to 40 years in prison. In Minnesota, it buys you 25 years in prison. And so I guess I think we need to understand better what third degree murder charges are and the weight that comes with those charges. What is the threshold for proving those charges? And then we need to consider whether or not that's something we want to, as a community, move forward as a possibility. Excuse me. Something we move forward as a possibility in other jurisdictions. Keeping in mind that many times when you go to the grand jury with evidence, if the charges are confined to a limited set, the grand jury will not proceed with holding the person accountable. And so these are real hurdles that we have to understand and have to deal with on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction level. The federal government cannot dictate to the states that every state shall have a third degree murder charge. What the federal government can do, and quite frankly, what our president, my commander in chief, could do, is exercise the power of his Justice Department to clearly move forward with civil rights violations, okay, in a very serious manner, to impact people on an emotional level, to let individuals know that we take this serious and this just won't be like the last time. And had that been done, it's my opinion that what we're seeing currently would look a lot different. Had those steps have been taken very early on afterwards, and with a degree of compassion and seriousness.
And going another different route, I'm talking about accountability. And as a man who is wearing a uniform, right? So I was telling you briefly that, I'm from Louisville, I'm in Louisville. And last night we were watching, the news, and we saw the National Guard presence in our downtown. We saw the interaction between the local police department, the National Guard, and the protesters. And first time in my lifetime that I've witnessed live, tear gassing, what do they call them? The fire, where it makes noise and the fire shoots up. So just allowed, to disperse crowds. And it was, and I was at home on the couch. I mean, not far from it. It wasn't far from where I actually was, but it was unsettling, right? And knowing that if I had been there in person, trying to reconcile how do I emotionally feel towards these people who are in uniform, right? That are charged with protecting me. That's who I'm supposed to go for when I need help. But now I have this other imagery in front of me. How do you reconcile that for, the civilians who are trying to figure out how to feel about people as individuals versus the system that we need to change?
Oh, that's a great question. Du Bois talked about the two-ness of being a Negro in America. And we can never forget The Souls of Black Folks, and that beautiful book that he wrote, where he talked about having to reconcile being both Black and being an American. And if you can't reconcile them, having them being torn asunder. That is very real, whether you wear this uniform or whether you walk as a proud American in the United States and are subject to unfair discriminatory behavior. What I can tell you is that if you understand the contributions that you're walking in as a part of a community and a tradition, you really understand the fact that we as a community have participated in every major war the United States has engaged in. Even when we did not have the full rights of enfranchisement, we fought for the interests of the nation. If you understand the economic contributions that we made, even while not being paid, to the formation of this nation, and the multiple other contributions that we have made, and because of our citizenship class have been denied the full fruits of, then you can feel and you can be very comfortable with the fact that we are American and the country is definitely indebted to us as a community. And when you stand and you sing the national anthem, or you stand and you sing America as Ray used to sing it, you can sing it with the same tone and with the same deep passion about that which you are singing about. Fundamentally, it's important because when we sing those songs, we sing it out of an experience. And so whether you listen to Aretha Franklin or Ray Charles or anyone else from our tradition sing those songs, we always start those songs on a low note. It's a deep note. When we say, oh, beautiful, we start low, okay? Or, oh, say, can you see? We start low because that reflects, okay, an emergence of a people in a country and a nation. So by the time we get to, oh, say, can you see? Okay, we're at the metaphorical question that we're asking. Okay, all right, we're asking that question because it's a part of our lived out experience in this country. We're saying, does that Star Spangled Banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave? We're not making an exclamatory statement right there. We're posing a question when we sing that song. Okay, it is not very rhetorical either. And so we are vested in the nation. The nation should be vested in us, and how each of us reconciles that two-ness that Du Bois talked about is a very individual thing. Some of us never reconcile it, and that's quite understandable. Some of us wrestle and struggle not only to reconcile it, but to help our children and others reconcile it. And you should not expect a lot of help from the wider society in understanding that. So it is a lonely walk that we have to navigate in some ways.
So, what do you think our next best first step is from here? Where do we go?
Well, I think we have to be able to have sober conversations that are rooted in fact and historical accuracies. The fact of the matter is that as we sit here, there's 17 agreements between the Department of Justice and police departments across the country. 13 of those are consent decrees. So when we talk about criminal elements in the society, we can speak on a broader plane than just citizenry. Okay, we have had formal processes of review of several different police organizations, and we have found rank discrimination and discriminatory practices throughout those organizations. Now, just because we put it under the rubric of a fancy title called a consent decree, we still have to, as policy and intellectuals, call that just what it is. It's racist thug behavior, right? And so the uniform does not shield you from the capability of being biased, being unfair, okay? It does not shield you from the possibility of being criminal. Doesn't mean that you are, doesn't mean that you aren't. Your actions go on to determine how you should be defined in a society, right? And so we've got to be able, when the conversations are held, and I think there's a lot of goodwill in the conversations that I'm hearing around Mr. Floyd's death. I think there's a lot of goodwill in the exchanges that I'm hearing and the thinking around this. I particularly like Trevor Noah's uh, social media thread that he had on it. But we've got to be able to call to the floor the facts of the matter in a very sober way so that all individuals can hear us, even people who might not traditionally
Right.
want to hear and want to engage in the conversation, right? If their attention is on it right now, and if this is an opportunity to bring them along as allies in a wider cause, then we've got to know how to do that through accurate accounting of the situation, both now and historically. I think there is a lot of goodwill. I do not think that, again, based upon how we're structured as a nation, there's going to be a lot we can do federally. But what the federal side of this can do is make reporting mandatory,
Mm.
right? They can be the data collection entities within the Department of Justice, not within the FBI, because the FBI is a law enforcement agency. So
Right.
you need a check and a balance there, right? So they can provide also infrastructure and recommendations through real commissions that analyze these issues, and real scholars and thinkers that are trying to really wrestle with how do we improve this democracy in these areas so that we get down to a point of maybe when it comes to issues of police and police behavior, this is what the process needs to look like. Now, does that mean that the local jurisdiction has to accept that? No, but we know that traditionally, when recommendations are made at federal levels, they are followed closely, if not exactly, by local jurisdictions, particularly when they have been found to work well.
Mm.
I think you have to include citizens at the table when you're forming the solution, and you have to know what's achievable and what is not achievable, right? So that you don't get disappointed, right?
Right.
There is a lot of prosecutorial discretion in our law enforcement system. Who gets charged with what
Mm-hmm.
is a black box, right? And so understanding that that is a position of power in the community
Mm.
may be then a point where we begin to think about who we put in those positions, because most of the time those positions have been chosen by democratic processes, and how we emphasize the district attorney versus the mayor.
Mm.
Everybody get up and jump and want to vote for somebody for mayor. And the reality of it is the district attorney may be having more of a deleterious impact in the community that you sit in, depending on what that community is. But certainly beginning to emphasize that office in our democracy in terms of the debates that we have and the forums that we allow those people to come to express their views before they walk into office and begin to uh, execute the powers of their office, having unique forums that can be sponsored by fraternity organizations and church groups and other organizations within the community, because we are now prioritizing who are the decision makers within our law enforcement and legal system.
Mm.
Okay, we stress the governors, we stress the mayors, we stress the senators and the representatives, and now it is time for our community to pay particular attention to our district attorneys, our prosecutors, and those individuals who are impacting the community probably as great as any other elected official.
And that is especially important, right, this year, as it is a big election year. And I think, to your point, your local officials, your local election is just as important as the big national elections, and making sure you know who these people are, what they're doing, how they're affecting your daily life, and making sure you're putting people in office that have your best interest at heart is always something that we need to talk about and reinforce. Well, as we come to a close, I try to always end on an optimistic note. And so you've given us a lot of things to think about, a lot of ways to challenge us in our professional and academic roles, but also as individual citizens. But in your perfect world, what would you like to see now that we have this national discourse around health equity, and COVID-19 has kind of taken the scab off of some of these old wounds and expose them for what they are? How do we come on the other side of this with something better?
Well, it's difficult because our attention spans are so short. We haven't begun to even talk about police union contracts yet, and how those contracts are developed with the mayor's office, and how, based on those contracts, the punishment that police are given are pretty much written into the union contract. And so being able to ask for different types of punishments once there's a contractual agreement with the city to do something else is quite impossible. So even the ability to review the union contracts that are being signed with most cities between the unions and the mayor's office would be a healthy start, so that we just understand the rules of the game that we're playing here.
Right.
It is very complex. A lot of the entities that we're frustrated with and challenged with are deeply entrenched in our political system. They're well funded. They know how to influence the political, and beginning to approach a system that is more reflective of the equality and sanity that I think most Americans would agree with is a long struggle and fight. But we can do it, but it really involves perpetual engagement, right? We can't be part-time citizens, right? We got to be full-time citizens, which means we have to know what's going on in our community, who's running for what, put forth names, support them, get involved, have collaborative communication with our police department long before anything has happened that is as egregious as what we've recently seen, and be willing to extend the same constitutional rights which we are demanding for ourselves to others. This is not a one-sided conversation. The democracy is better when it works as it is meant to work, and not when it is working according to any particular skewed agendas. And so what we really have got to focus on is, what does this new type of citizenship demand of each of us? And what does it look like, right? Because everybody's busy, family, job, etc. It really means that as a community, we get together and provide information to each other. Because I might not know everything about birthing outcomes. I might not know everything about preconception care and how that's going in the community, but there's someone that is my neighbor who has that expertise and comes to the public square, right, to talk about it, to keep all of us informed. One of the things that we have done, which is quite interesting, and we really don't know the results of, is we've had this erosion of the public square, right? We have gone digital. We're now guessing that social media can replace the public square. Well, that's an hypothesis. We don't know that. In the America that I grew up in, you went to church, and after church, you had a conversation about what was going on in the community with Mama and Big Mama and Auntie P.
Yes.
Okay. And that conversation was then the springboard for further conversations in the community that week, whether they occurred after choir practice or at other sorority or Masonic meetings, type of that. And so that constant engagement, right? That full-time citizenship thing where the community is in action and moving forward on the issues that it prioritizes is what we have to get back to. It is the root and the cement of the civil rights movement, okay, and feminism in this country, okay, that emerged out of communities that were cohesive, okay. So if the communities are not engaged and not cohesive, it's going to be very difficult to handle the big ticket items which Mr. Floyd represents.
Well, I think it's clear that this conversation is ongoing and not done. And that I hope that you'll come back and talk with me again so we can keep this going. And this is, yeah, I think we also have to remember this is not a one-stop solution, right? Like
No.
I think we often want to tie things up in a little box and put it on the shelf and like we fix this, and we know that this is not going to be fixed anytime soon. My hope is that now that we have started this conversation on a broader scale, that we'll continue the conversation. We will continue to have the conversation with people who weren't already having the conversation, so that we broaden our reach. We build our relationships with our allies, with our accomplices, and that we're able to move these policy changes that allow us to be a better, hopefully, society moving forward. But again, I thank you. I appreciate you taking time out from another country, doing very important work, to talk to me, to talk to us. I hope that you're safe, and you keep us posted on what you're doing and where you are. And I'll be in touch about when we can have another conversation to take this to the next step.
Always a pleasure. Love the Reede Scholars to death. We are a part of what's right in the country, and we're part of the solution. And I appreciate your leadership, Madam President.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Reede Scholars Live. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or subscribe to our YouTube channel.